So tonight, uh, Elder Pete Peterson is elder at the Clinton Presbyterian Church. We'll be reviewing all of this. He is retired military, but he's also retired church administrator of some very large churches, and we are fortunate to have him in our presbytery and on our coordinating team to help us with many things that we do. Especially you might, those of you from Highlands Presbytery might recognize him as the person who always presents the budget. So I'm going to hand it over now to oh, wait, before we do that, if you have questions, because we're going to try to do this within an hour. If you have questions, would you put them in the chat? And I will monitor that. And then at the end, we will have room for other questions. So write them down or put them in the chat. And at the end, Pete and I will answer whatever questions we can. So over to you, Pete, and I'm going to start we're ready to go.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm impressed that so many of you have chosen to spend an hour of your Wednesday evening with us to get an overview of what I'm calling the Presbytery's Financial Handbook. It's after doing church administration for 20 years, and being involved in the activity here in the Presbytery, I find this handbook to be a pretty decent reference to go to for being able to make sure that church financial operations are running the way they ought to keep people that are responsible for doing things out of trouble. And that's the main thing that we want to do. We want to make sure that you're having great success in managing your financial operations, but we also want to make sure that people who have specific responsibilities in terms of your financial operation understand the do's and don'ts so that they stay out of trouble. We're going to do an overview of the entire manual and hopefully have time at the end for a few questions. But I want you to understand that none of the information that we are going to give you tonight is real detailed information about how to do things. Again, the handbook is a great reference for you to go to, and it will have a lot more information that you can look up after we are finished tonight. The other thing that I want to give as a caveat is that while many churches, most churches perhaps, aren't able to afford having someone like a church administrator to run their financial operations and their church operations, the focus on the handbook is on the church treasurer, which is a required office that the Book of Order requires all churches to have. If you do have the luxury of having a church administrator or somebody performing that function in your church, many of the things that we'll talk about this evening will be being done by that person, your church administrator, if you have one. But that church administrator should be in constant and close communication with your church treasurer, because that is, in fact, a required office that the Book of Order requires churches to have. And so the church treasurer needs to be up on all the things that are going on. So hopefully your administrator is in good communication and close relationship with your church treasurer. Do we have the slides up, Gene?
Yes, I think they are. Do you all see the opening slide?
They're not on the screen.
Oh,
No.
all right. Now we have it.
All right. So the guide for financial activity in the church, next slide. We are going to be going through, hopefully get through the entire handbook to give an overview. It's got 8 chapters, and you see the titles of the chapters up on the screen. And in addition, there are 3 appendices to the handbook that I will refer to as we go through specific pages. Next slide, Gene. The principal thing that you need to understand is that this handbook that has been prepared is really intended for the individuals that are in your congregation who are responsible for doing the financial activities, and is written in large extent addressed to the church treasurer. But the handbook gives a good overview of all of these kind of operations. And so anyone who is involved in the church management would benefit from being able to use the handbook as well. Next slide, please. The first chapter of the handbook pertains to what the role of the church treasurer is. And the citing from the Book of Order is the first thing that you see on the screen. The session shall elect a treasurer for such a term as the session shall decide, and will supervise that person's work. It may be delegated to a board of deacons or a board of trustees if your church is one of those that has, for example, a board of trustees. And in a couple of the churches that I worked in, that's who I primarily related to, was the board of trustees. But the principal thing that we want to understand in terms of the role of the treasurer is that this person is going to be responsible for adhering to session policies for how offerings are to be counted and recorded. And the key thing here is that the Book of Order wants to see at least 2 appointed persons appointed by the session that are unrelated to the treasurer, or one person who is fidelity bonded to be responsible for doing the counting and recording of the offerings. The books, financial books and records, are to be adequate enough to reflect all of the transactions that happen within the church, and they are to be opened for inspection by authorized church officers. And there are to be periodic reports given back to the session about all of the financial activities, and the Book of Order says it shall be at least no less than annually, and we'll talk more about that. Next slide, please, Gene. The Book of Order also goes on to state that in places where the nonprofits are allowed to legally incorporate, that churches are in fact to form a legal corporation. And New Jersey is one of those jurisdictions where nonprofits are allowed to incorporate. So all of the churches that are in New Jersey should in fact have formed or be forming a corporation. And it is one of the requirements under the law is that a corporation must have principally 4 officers: a president, a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer. And that officer is elected by the congregation. In most cases, what's going to happen is the corporation treasurer is going to be the same person that the session has already elected as treasurer, but that may not necessarily be the case. But in most cases, that's going to be the case. And under the law, again, the corporation treasurer is going to be responsible for complying with all state and federal laws with respect to the financial activities of the church as a corporation. And that primarily means making sure that all reports are filed in a timely manner, and that reports are being given to the corporation in a timely manner as well. And the goal of the corporation treasurer is to be working with the personnel committee so that anybody else in the church that has responsibility for managing funds, for example, you may have a deacon board that has a deacon fund, and there's somebody on the board of deacons that's responsible for managing that money. You may have funds in your Sunday school, in your Christian ed department, and there's somebody appointed to be responsible for those. In all of those cases, those individuals that are managing those other financial funds within the congregation are responsible to the corporate treasurer for providing information, and it's the corporate treasurer that is overall responsible by law to make sure that all reports about the financial activity in the church are done. The session is responsible by book of order for providing insurance for the church, and one of the provisions is that it needs to have officers and directors insurance to protect the officers as they perform their duties. And lastly, the treasurer is accountable to the body that elected them. So the corporate treasurer is responsible for reporting out to the congregation. And also, if he's the elected or she is the elected treasurer for the session, responsible for reporting to the session. And we'll talk more about those reporting responsibilities as we go on. Next slide, Gene. The functions of the church treasurer are really overseeing all of the financial records of the church. And in most cases, what this means is that this person is going to be responsible for preparing the financial reports that go back to the session and to the congregation. This person is going to be participating in the budgeting process that will take place at some point during the year. And this person is also going to be making periodic reports to local legal jurisdictions and to the session within the church. The next slide, please, is a summary of the kinds of funds that the treasurer is going to be responsible for overseeing and being knowledgeable of and providing reports about. The first and basic fund that all churches are going to have is a general fund. We may call it a current fund, you may call it operating, you may call it simply your budgeted funds. But these are the funds that are used by the church for carrying out its day-to-day operations. These are the funds that are funding your Sunday school, your worship services, that are paying for your Christian education program, that are paying your pastor and any other staff that the church may have, paying your utility bills, those kinds of funds. In addition, many churches are going to have some kind of restricted or dedicated funds. And typically, these are funds that have been set aside in a lot of cases by the session for specific purposes. You may have decided that you need to have money saved for doing eventual capital repairs, or you may have money set aside for maintaining, for example, the church organ. If you have a church organ with pipes and all kind of stuff that require a lot of maintenance. Many churches will have separate mission funds. And so that's another category of funds that the treasurer will be providing oversight about. Most of our churches are going to participate in special offerings during the year, such as One Great Hour of Sharing, or the Christmas or Joy Fund, those kind of things. And those are typically going to be set aside and then paid out to the presbytery as required. Some churches have the benefit of having members who have remembered the church in their wills or have remembered the church out of their financial blessings and have given money to the church for endowment purposes. And we'll talk more about these as we go along. But all of these funds are going to have their own set of accounting, and the treasurer needs to be responsible for paying attention to all of those. The basic thing to pay attention to is that when you have restricted or dedicated funds, endowment funds and bequest funds, the session is going to get involved in deciding who within the church is going to manage those funds. It's not always going to be the treasurer that's going to have responsibility for oversight of some of that kind of stuff. But the treasurer is going to be responsible for providing the overall reports that contain the information about those kinds of funds. So we'll talk more about that. Next slide, Gene. A big problem, let me back up. I don't want to say it's a problem. A big area of concern for church operations is the whole area of internal controls and record keeping. It's a sad day whenever we hear on the news about churches that have had some kind of problem that has happened, embezzlement, some kind of fraud that has happened. And in most cases, when investigators go in and look at that, it can be ultimately determined that the reason why those kind of things happen is because there simply weren't adequate controls in place or they weren't being adhered to. And that's what got the church into trouble. And so one of the things that we want to highlight in our handbook is the necessity for having good internal controls and record keeping. And in simple terms, the session is the body that's responsible for determining and approving whatever policies are going to guide church operations along these lines. So some of the areas in which the church is going to develop policies is the kinds of purposes for which the church will accept money for endowments or for which they might accept bequests. Not all churches are going to want to accept all kinds of property, for example, that might come to it from outside the church. A family may decide it wants to leave an estate to the church, but that estate may have all kinds of issues associated with it that the church then becomes responsible for dealing with. So the session needs to have some well thought out guidelines for what sorts of conditions and what sorts of money it is willing to accept for endowments and bequests. The same thing applies to the kinds of things that the church is willing to accept as gifts. Many churches are more than willing to accept, for example, the gift of appreciated stocks or bonds and those kinds of things that somebody is willing to give to the church as part of their pledge for the year. But not all of those kinds of gifts are necessarily always going to be acceptable. So again, the session's going to want to be careful about developing well thought out policies about what kinds of gifts are going to be acceptable. There's a joke in the church management business that you never want to accept a cemetery. We have cemeteries within the presbytery that we're responsible for maintaining because most churches, a lot of churches in this area do have cemeteries. But again, is that something that a church would want to accept as a gift from somebody? That's something for the session to decide. Another area for the session to spend some time talking about and developing a policy about is investment policy. If you do happen to get enough money that you can set aside and you decide that you want to invest it, then you need to have in place appropriate policies that govern how the money is going to be invested, who's going to do that, and what are the conditions, what kinds of things will it be appropriate for the money to be invested in. So these kind of things are all part of internal controls for the church going forward. Next slide, Gene. The other areas that become important is the area of, and we do this every week, is the counting of the offerings that we take up during our worship service. And the Book of Orders pretty clear that the session needs to have an approved policy in terms of who's authorized to collect the offerings, who's authorized to count the offerings, and have the session needs a policy for how that gets recorded and how the money gets deposited. And in simple terms, whoever is collecting the money and making the deposits should be someone other than the one who's responsible for signing the checks and making disbursements out of the money that's in the bank. It's part of segregation of duties that becomes important as part of our checks and balances in internal controls. So most churches have a team of people who have agreed to be the counters for the offering after church on Sundays. And so the ushers collect the offering, and then it gets put into the church office, someplace safekeeping. And after church, a team of counters goes in, at least two, and they do the recording of what has come in as offerings. And they're keeping track of who it came from, how much it came in, and ultimately they're completing a deposit slip that goes with the funds that ultimately get deposited into a night deposit or right directly to the bank the next day, with copies given to the church treasurer, copies kept by the counting teams for accounting purposes, copies given to whoever is responsible for keeping the books, so that all of this stuff ties together. In addition, the session also needs to decide whether or not the church has needs to have church credit cards, and if it has credit cards, who's going to be authorized to have them, and the policies under what conditions those cards may be used, and how the receipts for the use of those cards are turned in and accounted for so that reimbursement can be made in a timely manner and the appropriate funds are accredited for those expenses that have been taken care of. The other place where the church needs to have policies is on how to reimburse staff or volunteers for any expenses that they incur for the church out of their own pocket. We don't necessarily like to see that kind of thing happening, but in truth, it happens all the time. Your person who's responsible for your Sunday school just happens to decide that, they need some candles for something that they're going to do in maybe vacation Bible school. And they get permission to go out and buy the candles. But when they bring the receipt in, that receipt has to be accountable and approved by somebody who's responsible by the session for approving those kind of receipts. So if it's worship expenses, the session is going to have a person that's responsible for approving worship expenses. Your Christian Ed program will have somebody approving those expenses. And all of these things tie in then to when the treasurer is signing off on the checks to pay out these expenses, that person has the ability to look at the appropriate authorization forms to see that the right person has signed off on the expense and that it's a legitimate expense and it's coming out of an appropriate line item in the church budget. These are all items that require a good discussion on the part of the session, and it's really helpful to have clear policies laid out at the beginning of the year, each year, for people who are going to be involved in making things happen in the church for how all of this stuff gets accounted for. Next slide, Gene. The big challenge in doing church financial administration is having a proper segregation of duties. And I talked about that a little bit at the very beginning. In simple terms, you don't want to have the person who is signing the checks to also be the same person who's been depositing the money into the church bank account. And you don't want that person to also be the one who's been authorizing reimbursement of the expenses to people. There should be a segregation of duties within the church so that one person is responsible for approving expenses in each area of the church for being paid out. Another person is responsible for preparing the checks that will be signed ultimately by the treasurer or whoever the session is authorized to sign checks. But there needs to be a segregation of the duties so it's not one person who is depositing the money and then spending the money and paying it out. And that can be difficult, particularly in small churches. So in my experience, what happens is most of the time, the church treasurer is going to be the one that's going to be signing the checks to disperse money out to pay bills, pay the utility bills, to uh, maybe be paying the salary, the paychecks, um, or reimbursing someone for expenses for uh, worship supplies, that kind of thing. But you want to have a system set in place so that when the church treasurer is signing that check, he or she can see that somebody from that ministry area has in fact approved the expenditure of those funds. And it's probably been somebody else, like the church secretary or another volunteer from the finance committee or council or whatever you call it, that has prepared the checks for signature for the treasurer to do. Another place that we want to pay particular attention in financial operations is making sure that the deposits of all the offerings and all income that comes into the church are properly recorded. So when we are in worship service on Sunday and we collect up the offering, in most cases, it's people from the church that are paying their money, their contributions to the church so that the church can continue to operate. And we want to be able to give those individuals credit for what they've given. In most churches, that might take the form of the offerings have been put into a labeled envelope that's associated with them, or they put a check that's got their name on it in the offering plate. So when the counters are going through the offerings that have been collected, they're making a record of all that money that's come in that can be identified with specific individuals, and they're keeping that record and giving it to the person who's responsible for recording all that information into whatever accounting system the church is using for recording individual contributions to the church. Then periodically over the course of the year, reports can be sent to these church members showing how much they have given so far. And at the end of the year, a record of all of their givings to the church for the year are given to them so that they have it to be able to confirm that everything's been accounted for, but it's also the kind of thing that they can then use if they are, for example, itemizing deductions on their income taxes. Another area of complication for churches is doing proper bank reconciliation. And this means reconciling the bank statements each month when they come. Typically, we'd like to think that the treasurer is the appropriate person to do that. But if the treasurer is the one who's signing the checks that are going out, internal control procedures suggest that somebody other than the treasurer should be the one that's actually going through the bank statements and reconciling what has been printed on the bank statement with what is actually coming out of the church financial records. And again, that can be a tough thing for churches to make sure that there's enough people around to do this. But typically, again, it might be somebody from your finance team in the church that has taken on the responsibility for doing the bank reconciliation. And if there's an issue, they can then go to the treasurer and try to resolve those kind of issues. We have a lot of records that we keep as a church, and all of those records require proper accounting. Some records are only temporary, a lot of records are permanent. And in the back of our handbook, we have a section that's called Records Retention Guide, which will give people in the church who are responsible for doing all the record keeping an idea of how long certain kind of records should be maintained. As an example, your church insurance records should be kept on file forever. You never want to throw away your church insurance policy, because it can happen that an insurance claim could come up years later that may in fact impact on what, as something that happened during a period in which you had an insurance policy, say 5 or 10 years ago, and you want to be able to go back and be able to take out that insurance policy and see what the requirements were, or what your insurance coverage was during that time. Other things like having your tax ID information, your bank account information, your software information, what kind of software you have, what the passwords are, what control numbers are, your different kinds of information like that. A lot of those things are required to be kept in like a fireproof container in order to preserve them in the event that a worst case things happens, like a fire in the church. You want them to have as much protection as possible. Most churches are now doing their record keeping using some kind of church management software. And that software should be backed up on a regular basis. A lot of them will have a feature set up where the information is being backed up to the cloud. Some of them, they'll have a hard drive that it's being backed up to, and there needs to be an effort to download that backup on a regular basis and take it off site in order to make sure that it's accessible if something happens to the church computer system and information has to be recreated. So that church record retention guide in the back of the handbook is a great place to go for some guidance for how to keep the records that need to be maintained within the church. Next slide, Gene. We've already talked a little bit about investments and endowments, and the trick here is for the session to give good thought to developing the appropriate policy, philosophy, policy, and guidelines for how to manage investments and endowment funds. These are very precious funds for most churches. And when they are properly invested, they can be a source of continued income for the church for years and years to come. But it requires the session to have a good understanding of why the church should be investing its funds in the first place, or accepting funds for endowment purposes, but those endowment funds being invested again. And so the church needs to develop a good statement of philosophy that is going to be used in guiding the church in how these funds are going to be invested. Page 20 of chapter 4 in our church handbook has some examples of how to put together these kinds of policies. But there's a list of guidelines that is the starting point for the session in putting together policies for how investment money and endowment money will be handled. The guidelines say things like include a statement of the primary investment objective. That could be something along the lines of making sure that we earn consistent income over the course of the year. We want the overall fund to increase by 8 to 10% a year and give us the ability to take a draw of 4 to 6% of the income that's generated to use for specific purposes, which will be laid out in the guidelines. That the fund should be invested as promptly as possible. That the church is taking advantage of its nonprofit status in terms of making its investments. That it is investing funds in well-qualified large corporations or high-grade commercial investment opportunities. And the policies can also go down to the specifics of who is in fact going to be the management firm or the management people for doing this investment. You may have some people in your church that are very qualified in doing these kind of investments. Typically, my experience is that a church will probably want to use an outside source, and so you'll want to be investigating the kinds of outside sources that are available for helping you invest your funds, and then you give them guidance that we don't want our funds, for example, to be invested in things that are harmful, like alcohol or gambling or unsafe for the environment, those kind of things. So all of that goes into developing your philosophies on your investment and endowment opportunities. The principal thing that the treasurer is going to be responsible for is reporting out to the session and the congregation what is happening with those investments, but making also sure that the policies that the session has laid out are being followed by whoever is managing these investment funds, whether it's a church committee that has been given responsibility for doing that, or it's an outside firm that the treasurer has regular meetings with to make sure that everything is being done according to the policies that the church has laid out. And then obviously, another record-keeping thing is maintaining the record of investments that the church has and where the money's coming from that's being transferred, for example, into the church budget, if that's how you've got it set up. Next slide, please, Gene. Big issue for every church is the need to have a full financial review of all of its financial records. This is a requirement that is given to us by the Book of Order. It is an annual requirement, and it does not tell us the extent to which this kind of review is done. So it's left to the church to decide what's appropriate for their own particular circumstances. If you are a large church that has a large budget and you have investment opportunities, or you have loans that you've taken out, your financial institutions may require that you have a full, what we call GAAP audit, which is an audit done to the generally accepted accounting procedures list of standards. And that is almost always going to be an outside firm that is going to be doing that kind of work for you. It is not usual that churches necessarily will be doing a GAAP audit. In most cases, a financial review is going to be done by churches. And that financial review, again, can be done either by outside sources or it can be done by a group of people within the church that have knowledge of doing that kind of financial review. So you have people in your church who are accountants or working in corporations where they have a financial review responsibility. And so you just need a team of like 3 or 4 people that agree to be your financial review team to do that kind of a financial review. But it's important for the church to have this done, not only because the Book of Order requires it, but because it helps to make sure that the internal control system is functioning and that people are staying within their bounds in terms of the kinds of work that they're being asked to do, whether it's the team that's counting the offerings on Sunday or it's the church treasurer in terms of signing off the checks after reviewing the documentation authorizing the expenditure. So there are several areas of focus for doing a financial review. These areas of focus are going to be found in the handbook on page 24 in chapter 5. And it's going to talk about the need to focus on cash receipts. This is where the team is going to investigate to make sure that the procedures that the session has approved for how the offerings are being collected and accounted for by the teams that have agreed to be responsible for doing this, are they following those procedures? Are they making a record of by name individuals have given money and how much money and for what purpose? And is it being properly tallied on an accounting sheet that shows how much money has been totally collected that Sunday, and it matches what's being deposited into the bank. So the financial review team will have a checklist or should have a checklist that they develop that allows them to double check several weeks over the course of the year to make sure that proper procedures have been followed for accounting for all of the cash and monies that have been received. By the same way, they're also going to do a check of the system to make sure that cash disbursements are following accepted procedures. Are the right people signing off, approving the disbursement of funds out of the church's budget? Is the documentation there? Is the church treasurer getting those documents before he or she is signing the checks that are making those disbursements happen? The verification of bank statements. Are the bank accounts, the bank statements that are coming from all the different bank accounts that a church may have, are they being reconciled on a timely fashion? And hopefully, are they being done by somebody who's not related to the either the depositing of the funds or the dispersing of the funds? You want somebody outside of that area who's responsible for doing those bank reconciliations. And so the financial review team is checking to make sure that that in fact is happening. To the extent that you might have loans where you're having to make regular payments on your loans, they'll be checking to make sure that the loan payments are being made properly and that the bank agrees with whatever the church records say are the current status of those loans. Some churches have petty cash funds. And again, there's going to be an accounting for those petty cash funds, and the financial review team will want to make sure that that is happening. And then a big important area is to make sure that member contributions are being properly recorded and being reported back to the church member for their review. In the event that something's been missed, they're given the opportunity to let the church know, hey, you missed this particular check. But there's going to be a record of that kind of thing, and the church financial review team is going to want to make sure that membership contribution records are being properly maintained. So that's a big important function for the church. And hopefully you have a good team of individuals who have agreed to help you out in making those kinds of things happen. Again, chapter 5 is a good place to start in training who's ever going to be doing your financial review function. Chapter 6 is the next chapter, and this is the chapter that's covering insurance and risk management. The Book of Order again requires the church to have property and liability insurance to protect its facilities, programs, and staff. And it also has to have directors and officers insurance to make sure that the elected and appointed officers are covered as well. Insurance is a complicated business, and we have the advantage that Gene has been involved in putting together a partnership program for our churches. I'm going to let Gene step in and give us an overview of that.
The New Jersey Presbyterian Insurance Partnership is through the Brown and Brown Insurance Agency. This partnership has actually been in existence since the late 90s, early 2000s. However, it just sort of chugged along and kind of got lost as staffing changed among the different presbyteries. So actually, all 7 presbyteries of New Jersey were part of this partnership back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then after the transition to 4 presbyteries, we started doing some work in Highlands Presbytery saying, well, maybe it's time to really look differently, and discovered that we had this partnership. So the partnership is all the churches, all the Presbyterian churches of New Jersey presbyteries can be part of I might not get the language quite right, but it's kind of like a master policy. So the more people you have in the policy, the better your coverage can be. So in this policy, this partnership, we have this master policy, which covers right now 161 or 62 churches in the 4 presbyteries. And because of that, we can keep the premiums at a manageable level. No one has low premiums, but at a manageable level. We also have, if you should have a major like a fire or something happens to your church property, it's always property. This gives you more depth of coverage than if you had your own policy. A year or so ago, we had to shift from the Philadelphia Insurance, who was our underwriter, to another company, and we were able to get into Guide One Insurance, which is a church insurance company, probably the best church insurance partnership. So now Guide One is the underwriter for our partnership program. The renewal year for Guide One is June 1st. So those of you who are not under Guide One and would like to learn more about it, you can contact Brown and Brown Insurance, and they will help you look at whether this is a good move for you to move to Guide One or not. You're welcome to do that. Actually, you can do that anytime during the year. Guide One will allow you to come in even after the renewal policy, the renewal date for everybody's policy. So after one of the things that's going to happen after 3 years of being with Guide One, we're coming into our 2nd year with them. They will have a payback on premiums to the presbyteries. So if everybody doesn't have many claims, there can be some payback to the to your premiums, but that won't happen for a couple more years. But that is one of those kind of benefits of being in the partnership. I'm going to go under to the recommended levels of insurance coverage. I don't have numbers here right in front of me, but we do we'll have on our website the recommended levels of insurance coverage as from Guide One. If you don't have Guide One, you don't necessarily have to follow these, but you do have to, these are really good recommendations for what you need for insurance coverage nowadays. So
You'll
that's
find
just
it in the
something.
handbook on page 28,
Oh,
starting on
did
page
I put it in the
28.
handbook? Okay, I did
Yes,
put
you
it in the
did.
handbook. Okay, so it's in the handbook of what are the recommended levels of coverage. You do have to have officers and directors, sexual misconduct, and you do have to have liability. Um, we also highly recommend you have property. It may be required, um, but there's the levels because someone will say, do we have to have this much or this much? And that is the recommended levels. On to personnel.
Personnel, chapter 7. This is an area that is complicated, and we're not going to have time to go into all of the detail, but I will tell you that I think chapter 7 is a pretty good checklist of things to pay attention to um, for all of your employees and volunteers. The principal thing that we want to highlight is that any employees and volunteers that are working with children are required to have background check. We have also a requirement that all councils, this is coming from the Book of Order now, all councils, and the session is the lowest level of council, must have a policy on child protection policy, sexual misconduct policy, and anti-harassment. And we're also adding anti-racism to that. And we have a requirement that all officers, employees, and volunteers working with children must take boundary training a minimum of every 36 months. I'm told by Gene that most of the churches in the presbytery, you've already been through this, through the boundary training thing, and you've already probably got a lot of this stuff in place. But again, chapter 7 is a good guide to go to for making sure that you know what needs to be done. The principal thing that I want to highlight is that the session is the hiring authority for the employment of your administrative staff, assuming that you have more than just a pastor. And some churches, that's all you got as a pastor. And if you've got just a pastor, then the pastor has been uh, put in your church by action of the presbytery. But for many churches, you at least have a maybe a part-time secretary or office manager. You might have a director of music part-time, those kind of things. And again, the session is the responsible uh, agency as for the employing your administrative staff. There's an extensive checklist that needs to be followed in terms of hiring people. There are reporting requirements for reporting new hires. There are documentation requirements that you have to get from all your new employees, things like the I-9 form and your tax deduction form, like your Form W-4, those kinds of things. You need identification records that are kept on file for employees. Um, if you are providing benefits for your employees, then you need all of the enrollment forms for the different benefits that your church is offering and those kind of things. So again, chapter 7 is a great place to go to for being able to figure out what you need to do in terms of documenting your new hires and making sure that you have what they need in order to properly get paid. Paying employees is a challenge for all churches. And who does that is a topic of a lot of discussion in the church administration field. A lot of churches choose to use an outside agency to do their payroll. So somebody from the church, like the treasurer or the office manager, provides the information to the company that is doing the outside company that is doing your payroll, and provides them the information they need in order to cut their paychecks. however often your people are getting paid, every 2 weeks, once a month, whatever the case may be. But paying people a salary also requires reporting requirements. So there's IRS forms that have to be filed on a regular basis. And again, if you're using an outside agency for doing that, the treasurer is going to want to make sure that the outside company is filing those IRS returns on a regular basis. If you're doing it yourself as a church, and a lot of churches choose to do that, then you need to really become familiar with what those requirements are for being able to, number one, withhold the taxes out of your staff paychecks and then paying them into the Internal Revenue Service at the regular times that they're supposed to be turned in so that everything matches up at the end of the year. It's a complicated business. Chapter 7 will give you a heads up in terms of how to do that. If you have some issues that you need to discuss, you're going to want to consult people like you're going to want to ask the presbytery maybe to provide some guidance or something for how you go ahead and do this. But this is an important area to pay attention to. The last area that we want to look at is the area of stewardship and budgeting, Chapter 8. The Book of Order requires that the session does both of these. The session is responsible for encouraging the graces of generosity and faithful stewardship, and the session shall prepare and adopt a budget for the church. The functions are two different functions. Ideally, your stewardship process is going to happen during the course of the year, over the course of the year. But in reality, what usually happens is the budgeting process is going to start towards the end of the summer, early fall, where the treasurer or whoever is your budgeting the people for the church send out a request to all the different ministry areas saying, give us your input for what you need for next year's budget. And a process is gone through within the church to put together a budget that is ultimately given to the session, and the session is the approval authority for the church budget. Once the budget is adopted by the session, then typically that's the point at which the stewardship process really goes off, because now you know how much money you're going to need to get through the next year, and you can build that into your stewardship program as you encourage people to give back to the Lord out of the generosities that they have received from the Lord over the course of the year and will receive from the Lord over the course of the next year. So it's two different processes, but they support each other. Stewardship helps to bring in the money that's needed to operate the church, and the budgeting process is the guide for how we do church operations. This is a lot of information, and I'm sorry that we couldn't be more specific about it. Do we have time for a couple of questions, Jean?
Yes, we do. And actually, we got a couple of questions here. Let's go to the chat here. First question, what if the congregation is so small you cannot garner 2 volunteers per Sunday to count? Well, you will have 2 volunteers. You should have 2 people in church who can count. Maybe just one person is responsible for it, but there's always somebody who can come and check their numbers. And that's kind of the point of it. There's not just one person doing all the counting. So someone counts it up, especially in a small church. We're not talking about a lot of money on a given Sunday. And then someone else then comes in and says, here, I agree, that's the same amount that I did. So I think you can. I think we make it too hard. There should be 2. If you can't get 2 people on a Sunday to check the money, then you need to be calling me because you got some other issues, kind of thing. But you should be able to do that. Are there recommended levels of insurance, a state mandate requirement versus a PCUSA requirement? I would say use that. It's more of the insurance company's requirement. PCUSA just requires you to have the insurance. Most insurance companies nowadays are going to tell you you have to have this as a minimum. So look at those numbers. If you're not with Guide One, talk to your insurance company. What is your minimum that they require? And then decide if that is what you feel is adequate for your church and especially for your property and liability. So what is in the handbook is what Guide One is, what actually Guide One requires of any group that is part of ours. You do have to meet that. They are very helpful in looking at how to keep your premiums down by looking at what is your deductible. So it's really good to have those conversations with your insurance company. And again, if, because we've had several have Church Mutual and have been dropped recently. So pay attention to that. And Guide One is you're not required to be in the New Jersey Presbyterian Insurance Partnership, but it might be something you might want to look at going forward, but you're not required. You're just required to have insurance. I know some churches have a local company, which they've been very happy with, and we just says, that's great. You just have to show us you have insurance, kind of thing. Can the session designate responsibility for employment of administrative staff to the Personnel Committee, which reports to the session? Yes, they can. But the treasurer responsibilities need to be with the treasurer, and that's usually the reporting. So they just need to clarify who does that. If they're not going to have the treasurer do that, and they're going to have the Personnel Committee do that, that needs to be clarified in writing that is who is responsible for that. Especially when it comes to something like a Board of Pensions, because you have to have an employer representative, and probably 9.5 times out of 10, that employer representative is the treasurer. But sometimes it's not. So it just needs to be written down who does what kind of thing, especially when it comes to personnel. And some have a big enough staff that the Personnel Committee takes care of all that kind of stuff. Where can I get this book? You can get this book on the Presbytery of the Highlands webpage.
HighlandsPresbyterianNewJersey.org.
Yep.
Go to the resources and documents tab at the top of the page. Click on that. Go down to the treasurer link towards the
Put a
bottom of
link
the
to it
page.
in the chat.
I'm gonna try to do that.
I did that. It's there right below his question.
Thank you, Jamie, because I couldn't get to my screen yet,
Yeah.
because of the PowerPoint. But there it is. It's right there in the chat. You can get that book. Should insurance policies be approved by the session? Absolutely. Session approves everything. That kind of thing. So yes, insurance policies have to be approved by the session. Kind of thing. A couple of other things before I say what are your questions. Corporations in New Jersey, one of the things we found in like the 12 plus years I've been in New Jersey doing this is a couple of times our churches went to apply for PILP loans. And in the PILP loan, you have to send in your articles of incorporation. And when they went to look for their articles of incorporation, they couldn't find them. And usually, if you can't find them, then you go to the state. There's a state website you can go to and get your articles. Churches lose them. Well, in doing that, they found out they never had articles of incorporation. So this might be something you want to look into, especially those churches that are over 250 years old. Kind of look and make sure you have articles of incorporation because you all got grandfathered in by the state many decades ago, and they never needed to show that. And a lot of them thought they were incorporated, but they're not. Also, when Pete was talking about all funds, The treasurer responsible for all funds in the church. They mean all funds, including like the deacons fund, which is the deacons have their own checkbook. Presbyterian women have their own checkbook. A lot of them don't anymore. They've all kind of centralized it into one, but many of them still do. And it's honestly not, at least from my experience as a pastor, it's not worth the fight to take away their checkbook. And but the deacons, the Presbyterian women, the Sunday school, the women's circles, the men's groups, they need to know that they do have to report that, and the treasurer is responsible for all funds, including theirs, kind of thing. I think that covers my. Oh, the other one I get often, another comment I get all the time is, our church is so small, we're all related to each other. We can't do the financial review, because it can't be related to them. And I say, find another small church, get to know them and say, we'll do your books if you do ours.
There you go.
And that works out. They've always said, can the presbytery organize that? And the answer is no, because you have it just it's just too much. But you know who your neighbors are, your neighboring churches, people, and just work out something with that other church, and say, here, let's pick a day and everybody get together and do each other's annual review, especially in the small churches. It doesn't take that long.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
Gene, I have a question. So for churches that have multiple checkbooks, deacons and Presbyterian women and that kind of thing,
Mhm.
how often should there be an account? I mean, should they report monthly, or how often should they report to session what their balances are and
Well,
expenses are?
I
and
think the
that
Book
kind
of Order just says annually.
of-
However, I think it should be at least quarterly. It just depends on how active that account is. Um, Most of those accounts, like Presbyterian women, deacons, and stuff like that, they're not super active accounts. So I think they should report to session quarterly. That's my opinion, but the Book of Order says annually.
And the other thing to
Okay.
bear in mind is that, churches have an annual meeting. They're required to have an annual meeting. And usually financial report is one of the big things that is part of that financial meeting. All of those additional funds that we're talking about, from the Sunday schools, your your Christmas market, your deacon fund, all of those funds are reported in that annual report that's made to the congregation.
Right. Now it's
And the
usually
treasurer is
that,
responsible for making sure that that happens.
and that is an annual report to the congregation, but I also think there needs to be some sort of annual report to the session. Not just to say, oh, here's session, here, this goes into the annual report. They need to be reporting directly to the session. But I say quarterly, just here's our quarterly statement, goes into the minutes. Other questions?
Gene, I have a question. We have the corporate treasurer, and I'm chairman of the finance committee.
Mhm.
But it appears that I'm doing all the duties that the treasurer is
Yeah,
listed in your handbook doing.
right.
And it just seems that, if we have a corporate treasurer, they should be handling those responsibilities.
And that can be a challenge in many churches. Your finance committee, particularly the moderator or chair of the finance committee, by default ends up having to do a lot of the stuff that the treasurer should be doing, which is why the session really needs to give thought to who they elect to be the treasurer. You want a person who is going to have the commitment to being able to do the things that are going to need to be done. And they really ought to have a list of what those responsibilities are before they agree to become the treasurer. But by default, somebody like you, Dan, are probably doing a lot of those functions.
I'm doing everything.
Yeah,
And-
and that's unfortunate. And that's a discussion that perhaps your session needs to wrestle with.
And the
Okay.
Book of Order does say the corporation one, where there is a corporation, is elected by the congregation. And the session has to appoint a treasurer at least annually. They can make it longer. They can make the term longer. I usually say no more than 5 years, but the Book of Order is unclear. But they can, so they can't let it become default to the whoever's chairing the finance committee. It needs to be appointed by Book of Order. And I agree with Pete. There needs to be position descriptions and clarity to all those different roles and who is responsible to what.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thanks, Donna. Thanks, Jamie. Well, thank you all for coming. We went a little over our hour, but glad we were able to be here to answer all the questions. If you have other questions, feel free to contact me. I'll put my email in the chat, or you can contact Pete. I'm volunteering him right here.
It's fine. I've already volunteered.
And because Pete has that church administrator knowledge that is really valuable. So you can contact either of us or just send an email to the church office. Sonia will get it to us, and we'll try to answer any questions that we have. For those of you who are part of the Financial Sustainability Project, we will try to be doing a newsletter every couple of weeks, and we'll try to get answers in there or send you a direct answer. But if we think it's something that be helpful for the whole group, we'll put it in that newsletter that we'll put out every couple of, roughly every 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. It all depends on the time of the year. So thank you all for coming. And we do have our next workshop is on legacy giving with Rose Niles from the Presbyterian Foundation, and that is on Monday, March 3rd at 7 o'clock. And there is a registration on the webpage for that if you are interested in learning about how can we either up our game in our legacy giving or even start a legacy program in your church. So thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.